With that, I'll yield back. Sorry, I thought you were free, but Mr. Issa is here, so I'll recognize the gentleman from California.
Thank you. You're almost free. I want to try to put something in perspective and then ask a very broad question. I think when you're the last to ask, a wrap-up question sometimes has less fact and more history. That silver-haired gentleman over my shoulder, the late Henry Hyde, he hadn't served 5 years in this body, even though he served 35 years, when Iran, under its present government, using the guise of, quote, students, took hostage all of our embassy personnel and kept them for 1,000 days, negotiating with the Jimmy Carter administration as though there was something to negotiate, but never providing them until it was in their best interest. Mr. Hyde was still a junior member, and a lot less gray hair, as they proceeded to fund terrorism around the world, including blowing up our Marines in '82 in Beirut, including the formation funding of Hezbollah from its inception till today. Hafez Assad was still running Syria and counted on Iran to provide him with money and munitions for decades between the time Henry Hyde was a fairly young man and now approaching his 100th birthday. We have gone 35 years with a government that funds and exports terrorism, who has used its vast oil wealth not even to create in their country, even to create the ability to refine their own oil into gasoline. Their priorities have been on exporting terrorism, destabilizing both the Sunni Arab world and, quite frankly, the opportunity for peace in Israel. For 35 years, you can point to Iran as the single closest reason of why we do not have peace for the Palestinians and the Israelis. So let me ask the question. I'll start with Mr. Hanna. I'll go to all of you. Why in the world are we negotiating and talking today about a small part of a small delay in their ambition to have the ultimate weapon to give them impunity to continue doing what they've been doing for 35 years?
If that's the objective, and if that's where we're headed, as I said in my testimony, Congressman, I don't think it's worth the candle to be going down that route, especially if we're ignoring the fact that this export of terror has only escalated and accelerated in the last year. I don't think that should be the objective. I think our objective should be to present them with a choice that either you stop this nuclear program that is the greatest threat to international security that exists today, or your regime will be put at serious risk by the United States by the combination of a threat of military force that is very credible and crippling economic sanctions that essentially shut down the Iranian economy. Without that choice, I think this is a fool's errand.
Mr. TK, obviously the whole day we've been talking about a fairly narrow part of our relationship or lack thereof with Tehran. But again, fundamental question. It's been asked wonderfully as to whether or not we should tag on to the back end of the President's negotiations. But the bigger question is, why is a member of Congress who was still a first lieutenant in the Army with no gray hair, not much hair actually at the time, and now 35 years later is sitting here, why is it that I should believe that we should even be talking about the scope of, well, if you'll just slow down to a crawl your nuclear development, then we've got a deal, and completely ignore the human rights violations inside Tehran or Iran, but particularly the constant export of terrorism in which country by country it is Iran's goal to, in fact, destabilize countries, both our friends and our foes within the Arab and Muslim world.
Well, I think I agree with the thrust of your question, Congressman. We shouldn't be ignoring human rights abuses in Iran. We shouldn't be ignoring the fact that Iran has a very aggressive regional policy today. And particularly, we shouldn't be ignoring the fact that something that we don't talk about is Iran today is undertaking military invasion of Iraq with the seeming complicity of the Iraqi government and at least the passive indifference of the international community. Its
And
relationship
I don't mean
Hezbollah.
to interrupt you, because your answers are great, but you know, as many of us that were on the dais earlier know, Iran was providing the expertise to blow up, dismember, and kill our people from the very first days that we put boots on the ground in Iraq. They were providing advanced IED capability. So it's not like they haven't been doing that steadily, including hundreds and perhaps thousands of Americans are dead because of their assistance. But please continue.
I would just say that all activities of Iran that are unsavory, of which the catalog is a long one, and the principal victims of the Iranian regime are the Iranian people, and then everybody else in the region. All those should be part of the American policy. Nuclear agreement or not, in my view, we are destined to remain adversaries with this particular regime, and we should approach the relationship accordingly.
Thank you, Mr. Einhorn.
Congressman, you asked the basic question, why should we be negotiating on the nuclear issue with a regime that's done all these terrible, destabilizing things? And I think the reason is that if we can stop their nuclear march toward nuclear weapons, then we can prevent a situation where they can do all of these bad things, but under the cover of a nuclear weapons capability. In other words, they could be empowered to do much worse. That's why it's important to deal with the nuclear issue. At the same time—
Let me characterize it, Chairman, if you'll give me a little indulgence. If I'm characterizing your statement, what you're saying, in a nutshell, is if they get a nuke, we'll never be able to stop them from terrorizing all of their neighbors, exporting their terrorism with impunity.
I don't mean to say that.
Well, but what you're saying is if we can stop them, they won't be able to do it. For 35 years, they've never quit doing it. So if they get a nuke, not only will they not quit doing it, but we won't be able to encourage them to quit doing it. Is that correct?
No, if they get a nuke, they'll be empowered to do worse. It doesn't mean that if we get a nuclear agreement, they're going to stop doing that. We're going to have to counter them on these other behaviors with or without a nuclear agreement. And we should be doing more of that, as some of the other panelists have mentioned.
Ambassador, you look like you've got your mic on.
Yeah, Congressman Issa, your question cuts very close to the bone for me. When I was a junior Foreign Service officer and was Special Assistant to George Shultz, I was the person who had to wake him up in the middle of the night when the Marine barracks was bombed in Beirut. I went to Beirut with him in April of 1983 after our embassy was blown up and Bob Ames, the National Intelligence Officer for Middle East, was killed. I served as Undersecretary for Defense for Policy for 4 years in the Bush administration from 2005 to 2009, and had to watch as the Shabani network and others, as you indicated, were killing American men and women in Iraq. I had to watch, after I made 6 trips to Lebanon to help arm the Lebanese armed forces to try and create an independent military to withstand, to stand the country up after Syrian forces had withdrawn after the assassination of Rafiq Hariri, and watched Iran's terrorist proxies in Lebanon upend all of that in May 2008. So I feel the gravamen of your question to my core. And as I suggested in my statement, we have to be prepared to contest Iranian struggle to dominate the region across the board on all dimensions. I do think it is worth negotiating with them on the nuclear issue if we can stop them from getting a nuclear capability. I have very grave concerns, as I said earlier in the hearing, that we have retreated well beyond that red line to the point that what we may end up doing is ratifying an Iran with an industrial-scale enrichment capability on the threshold of a nuclear bomb.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, in closing, I pointed to my old friend, the late Henry Hyde. When I was a freshman of Lebanese-American descent, or Lebanese descent and American, Henry Hyde allowed me to go on a Codell. And the first speech I ever made in a foreign country, I made in Lebanon at our embassy there, just above the monument, a memorial to those men and women that were killed both at the barracks and at the embassy, because our embassy was also blown up. And at that time, I said, Hezbollah is a cancer on Lebanese society. What I wish I could go back and say in that speech is something a little fuller. Hezbollah is a cancer on Lebanese society, funded, supported, paid for by Iran, and until we stop Iran from exporting terrorism, there will not be free people in Iran, in Syria, in Lebanon, and I fear in most of the Arab and Muslim world. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for this hearing today. It's a good start on pushing back against giving up something that is as worth fighting for as the Cold War was for most of my parents' lives. Thank you. I yield back.